What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video. Today we're going to be talking about the Stamina Templar. So the Stamina Templar is one of those Stamina DPS classes that a lot of guilds like to have in their group, mainly for Power of the Light. Power of the Light is one of the most reliable sources of Minor Breach and Minor Fracture. So both of those provide 1320 penetration to spell and physical. So it's not that big of a difference, but it is a pretty nice buff nonetheless. Basically allows you to take some points out of piercing or spell erosion and put them into other nodes if you have a Stamplar in the group. Now, while Stamplars do provide a very useful buff, or I guess debuff I should say, they are kind of saddled with bad sustain. So Stamplars, unlike a lot of Stamina DPS, kind of have fairly poor sustain. They definitely have worse sustain than Stamplars and Stamina Nightblades. Mainly because they don't really have any way of returning resources. So Wardens have, for example, the Bowlnetch, Samsorgs have Dark Deal, and Stamina Nightblades obviously have, I think it's Leeching. And DKs obviously run heavy attack builds, so they don't really have to worry about sustain at all. So that kind of leaves the Stamplars as kind of the odd one out, where they have to run a light attack rotation, but they can't really sustain it without having to weave in a heavy attack here and there. So that's kind of where Stamplars stand. They do very decent DPS. They pull pretty much on par with Stamsorgs, or at least I pull pretty on par with a comparable Stamsorg. But like I said, their sustain does need some work. But if you're able to master a Stamplar, a lot of groups will want you just for that powerful light, that minor breach, minor fracture debuff there. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over our skills, our seed point distributions, our gear. We'll talk about everything that you need to know in order to make this build, basically recreate this build. And we'll talk about a couple of gear replacement options in case you don't have certain gear sets, or you don't want to run certain things, or you're unable to run certain things because you don't have DLC or anything. So I'll also be talking about things like that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. First, we're talking about gear. So we'll be going with Selene's. Selene's is definitely a very strong set now. Now that they've changed how light attack scale max resources, Selene's actually ends up beating Veladress in some cases. It really depends on whether or not you're wearing Relequen. So more on that a little bit later. So Selene's is also easier to obtain than Veladress, so you can go with Selene's, and you'll probably pull equal DPS if you're wearing Veladress. And you can also wear Veladress if you want to. That's definitely not a bad idea. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to run. So like I said, Selene's is able to pull pretty even with Veladress now, but it will pull ahead if you're using Relequen. So because Relequen can proc Selene, so you'll be able to proc it while you're on your back bar. So you get more procs out of Selene's that way. So if you are using Relequen, definitely use Selene's. Now, one other option that I do want to mention here is going to be Stormfist. This is mainly if you're having trouble sustaining. So Stormfist, the one piece adds additional stamina regen, which you might find useful. The proc itself does have some weaknesses in that it doesn't really scale off of your CPs or anything like that very well, because it does shock and then physical damage. And the boss needs to be pretty much stationary in order to get the most out of Stormfist, because that big hit at the end happens after 3 seconds. So if the boss moves out of your proc, then you basically lost the DPS from Stormfist. So Stormfist might help you with sustain, but it also has its weaknesses in that the proc itself is not necessarily reliable on mobile bosses. The same thing with Selene's. Selene's might not necessarily be the best for mobile bosses unless you're constantly chasing them down. Veladress is a little bit better for mobile bosses because the proc itself can travel a fair distance. So with good timing and good knowledge of where the boss is going to go, you can sometimes aim the spore so that it'll hit the boss as to where it's going, or you can kind of intercept it as it's running back to position. So those are your 3 main options there for Monster Helm sets. Now, for your body sets, this is a 5-piece set that's going to be either on your armor or your jewelry, so basically it's active on both bars. We're going with Relequen. Relequen is incredibly powerful. It's still very strong in Wolfhunter. So I have the perfect version here. Go with the imperfect version if you aren't able to clear Vent Cloud Rest +1. The difference here is going to be that 5-piece set bonus, that max stamina. The perfect version has it, the imperfect version does not, so the imperfect version is a little bit weaker, but the proc is still just as strong on the imperfect version as it is on the perfect version, and that's what we're going for there. Now, if you're not able to get Relequen, or you then you're going to want to run War Machine instead. Let me pull out War Machine real quick. I actually don't think I have it out. So War Machine is the other option that you can wear if you don't have Relequen, if you can't access Relequen. So War Machine does come from Halls of Fabrication, so you will need to have the Morrowind DLC to get it. But because Templars will be using Crescent Sweep as their ultimate, that ultimate only costs 72 ultimate, so it's pretty cheap. So you'll be able to get pretty good uptime on that Major Slayer on the 5-piece bonus. And plus, you'll be able to give it to 2 other people nearby. So that's really nice to have. It's a really good buff set to use. Sometimes you'll have the Templar wearing War Machine in order to give their Stam Nightblades, obviously, the Major Slayer buff, so they're able to go full damage with Relequen and advancing Yokeda. So that is another option there. Failing that, if you don't have War Machine, then you can go with something like Hunding's Rage, which is always going to be very consistent. You can even go with Automaton, which drops from Dark Shade Caverns, because a lot of your damage is physical damage. It does scale pretty nicely with on a Templar, so you can go with Automaton if you'd like. You can even go with Vicious Ophidian on the body if you'd like, if you want to maintain that minus Slayer bonus. Vicious Ophidian also has the advantage of reducing the cost of your stamina abilities by 8%, so that does help out your sustain by a very noticeable margin. So for me personally, if I wasn't going to be using Relequen, I would probably be using War Machine. Failing that, I would use VO, and then I would use Automatons or Hunting. So that's what I would use for my body set. Now for our front bar set, we are going with the Ravager. So the Ravager is a heavy set that comes from Cyrodiil. So you can either get it from Wars of the Worthy, or specifically the Wars of the Worthy that you get from Cyrodiil. I don't believe the ones from Battlegrounds necessarily drop it, but you can also buy it from using AP from Vlistarius if your faction owns the Merchant flag in Vlistarius. So that's where you can get the Ravager. So it is a heavy set, so you will need to run 3 jewelry and 2 weapons. You can actually run 1 Ravager body piece, like so non-jewelry piece if you would like, because we are going with a heavy piece here. We are going with 6-1 because we do need some additional health because we are using Dubious Camoran Throne to help us sustain. So that's one option there. But most people will run 3 jewelry and then 2 daggers. So you can go with Dagger Axe, or you can go with Dagger Dagger. Both of them are decent options, but Dagger Dagger is going to be the stronger option here, mainly because on a Templar you have 10% additional crit damage. So having that additional crit chance increases your crit modifier, which in turn increases the amount of DPS you're able to pull. It basically increases your ceiling by a little bit compared to using an axe. So again, Ravager, double dagger. If you don't have the Ravager, because Ravager you can buy it off of Guild Traders, so that is an advantage there. But if you don't want to spend the transmute crystals and transmute jewelry, because they only come in healthy jewelry, so you will have to transmute them to Bloodthirsty and Infused in this case, then you can go with something like Advancing Yokeda, which is also needs to be transmuted. It is a heavy set that comes from Hellraw. So Advancing Yokeda is another option for Ravager if you don't if you don't want to buy it, if you don't want to spend any gold, you just want to farm it. Failing that, those are the 2 main sets that I would actually use here. So there's not that many sets that I could think of to replace this this front bar set here. Mainly because the way our bars are set up, we have our Crescent Sweep on the back bar, which means we can't use War Machine on the front bar. It needs to be on our body. If we were to use Crescent Sweep on our front bar, we would need to basically play around a little bit with our bars. It is still possible to do so, so you could still use War Machine on the front bar, but you will lose noticeable DPS because you will need to swap out Flawless Dawnbreaker on the front bar for Crescent Sweep. So while you could also do War Machine on the front bar here, it's not something that I would necessarily recommend if you have access to Ravager and or Advancing Yokeda. So those are the 3 main sets that you could potentially use on the front bar here. Now failing that, you can always stick with something simple like Hunding's Rage or something, but you are going to notice the DPS drop if you are using Hunding's Rage and you swap over to Ravager or something. You'll see a noticeable increase in DPS that way. So those are kind of your options there. Now real quick, let's go over traits, enchants, things like that. Oh, in our back bar we have Maelstrom Bow, of course. So talking about traits and enchants, so on our body pieces we have all stam except for one small piece which will have a max health enchant. Again, we are using Dubious Camoran Throne, so we do need a health enchant in order to get our health up to about 17k or so, just shy of 17k. Remember, stamina doesn't have any shields, so we will need the additional health here in order to kind of make up for that. In addition to that, we do have one heavy piece here. So Relequen and War Machine, they all come in medium, so your heavy piece will have to be your monster helmet, either your shoulders or your head. So that's kind of how that works there if you're running that. If you're running something like Hundings, which you can craft, then you can have like a heavy Hundings chest and have your monster helmet that be medium pieces. But if you are going with Relequen and War Machine, you will need that heavy piece to be either a shoulder or a helm. For your jewelry, we have 3 weapon damage enchants here. With this current rotation that I have here, you don't really need any additional regen here. We do have 1 heavy attack per front bar rotation, so you are able to run 3 weapon damage glyphs. You don't need to worry about running a stamina regen glyph at all. We have 1 Bloodthirsty and 2 Infused. Infused is stronger on stamina DPS compared to Robust, just because stamina DPS have a lot more weapon damage modifiers compared to max stam modifiers. You can go with 3 Bloodthirsty. 3 Bloodthirsty will pull just a little bit higher than this combination here. You can also go with 3 Infused if you'd like. It's kind of up to you. They're all any combination between Bloodthirsty and Infused, so like 1 Bloodthirsty, 2 Infused, 2 Bloodthirsty, 1 Infused. Those are all pull pretty similar DPS. They're all within about 1k of each other. Now for our dual wield bar, our main hand is still going to be nirn honed. It still carries over from Somerset and previous patches here, but we are going with the disease damage enchant. You can replace this with an absorb stamina enchant if you'd like for the additional sustain. That's kind of up to you if you want to do that. The DPS difference is obviously disease is going to be a little bit better just because it scales better with your TP. But absorb stamina does help out with that sustain if you need the additional sustain there. Our offhand is going to be a precise dagger with the weapon damage enchant. It's no longer infused. They did fix the infused bug where it was also affecting your main hand enchant cooldown. So we're going with the precise instead for that additional crit chance. We're still sticking with the weapon damage enchant, however, that is still there. Down for our bow bar, we have the infused Maelstrom Bow, poison damage enchant. So they did change how back bar enchants work. So any weapon ability that you use on your back bar will proc your back bar enchant instead of your front bar enchant while you're on your front bar. So this basically means if we have an infused poison damage enchant on our back bar, it'll actually out DPS a nirn bow with double ravage health poison. So you will need to retransmute your bows if you were running nirn last batch to infused and use a poison damage enchant. Now, if you're going against somebody like Rakat or any of the bosses in AA except for the mage, where you can use a prismatic enchant, you would replace this poison damage enchant with a prismatic enchant and this main hand enchant with a poison damage enchant. So that is for fights where you have to use a prismatic glyph. So your primary damage enchant is basically always going to be on your bow, then your secondary damage glyph is always going to be on your main hand here. Alright, so that is pretty much it for gear. Let's talk about our character sheet. So this is just kind of generic information here. We are Redguard. Redguard is pretty much a must if you're going to be a Templar. You can go with other stamina class races, but Redguards just have the additional sustain that you need to basically run this entire rotation without running out of stamina every now and then. So Redguards do get 10% max stam and they get 9% stamina regen. But the big thing here is going to be the Adrenaline Rush passive, which restores basically a little bit of stamina every couple of seconds whenever you deal direct melee damage. And it works out, the passive actually works out to be about 140, I think, regen. So that's actually very noticeable not having that if you're not a Redguard. Other stamina races that you might want to consider using if you don't want to be a Redguard, Khajiits are one option. Khajiit do not have any max stamina passives though, so you have the lowest amount of stamina as a Khajiit. You have 10% additional stamina regen, and you get 8% additional weapon crits. Basically, the Khajiits trade off max stam for additional weapon crit. Again, that does increase your damage, your crit modifier, which in turn increases the ceiling of your DPS, but you also have to consider you are losing your max stam. So that does also decrease your damage a little bit. So that's something you want to take into consideration. It does also affect your sustain as well, not having that additional stamp. Bosmer, the Wood Elves, are another option if you want to not be a Redguard or you don't want to be a Khajiit. They get 6% additional max stamina, they get 20% additional stamina regen. But that's pretty much it for Bosmer. That's all they have going for them. So the Redguards still have better sustain overall as well as better resources. Bosmer are an option though if you do want to play them. They're also better for PvP compared to Redguards. And finally, if you have access to the Imperial Edition, you can actually be an Imperial too. They get 12% max health and 10% max stamina, so you won't have to worry about running a heavy piece. You won't have to worry about running a health enchant. You can just go all medium with all stamina enchants because that 12% additional health. But they don't get any additional sustain boost. They don't have anything there. So the Imperials are really good for survivability, but not so great for sustain. They still got a 10% max stamina though, so they still have comparable resources to Redguards. For our attribute points, there are actually two distributions I want to talk about. So this one here is if you're running the Ravager. So the Ravager does have a max health set bonus, so you don't need to run any points into health. You can run all points into stamina and still have close to 17k health. Now, if you are not using the Ravager, if you're using Advanced Yokeda instead, then you will need to put points into health. You need to put 10 points into health, 54 points into stamina without the Ravager. So that's something you want to keep in mind there. So you might need to change out your attribute points if you are swapping out between Ravager and some other sets, for example. For our Mundus Stone, like all of the other standard DPS, we are running the Lover here. If you decide to run Twice Fanged Snake, that's one set that you might want to use potentially. If you're running Twice Fanged Snake, then you don't need to run the Lover. Running the Lover will end up over penetrating if you're running Twice Fanged Snake on the body, in which case you will be swapping the Lover out for the Warrior. A lot of stamina DPS aren't running Twice Fanged Snake though, because that means giving up Relequen, and Relequen does a lot of damage. But that is something I did want to mention here. If you do want to use Twice Fang instead of Relequen, you will be running the Warrior instead of the Lover. Then for food, we're running Dubious Camoran Throne for additional stamina regen, because we do need it in order to help sustain our light attack rotation. There is a gold version of Dubious Camoran Throne called the Artaeum Takeaway Broth. That's basically a slightly upgraded version of Dubious Camoran Throne. The downside of using it, though, is that it's very expensive right now, and that's mainly because it uses a alchemy ingredient that's only found in Somerset, and it is actually fairly uncommon even within Somerset. So it is very expensive to make and use right now. So by all means, don't feel like you have to use it. It does do more DPS than Dubious, but it's a very small difference. So you can stick with Dubious. Dubious will get you through all the content in the game. Now let's talk about our skill bars here. So on our front bar, we have Biting Jabs, Rending Slashes, Power of the Light, Rearming Trap, Blazing Spear, and Flawless Dawnbreaker. We obviously will not be using Flawless Dawnbreaker as our damage ultimate. This is just there for the additional weapon damage increase here. Then on our back bar, we have Razor, Caltrops, Poison Injection, Endless Hail, Repentance, Rearming Trap. We actually will not be using Rearming Trap while it's on our back bar. We're going to be using it on our front bar here. And then Crescent Sweep. So this is the main ultimate that we're going to be using for damage. So there are a few options here that I do want to mention. So I mentioned earlier that you could run War Machine front bar, which means you would have to basically swap where your ultimates are. So Crescent Sweep would be on the front bar, Flawless Dawnbreaker would be on the back bar. In this instance, you would also have to swap where Repentance and Blazing Spear is. That way you still have that additional crit damage here, because you do need to have an Adric Spear ability slotted to get that 10% additional crit damage. So that's what you would do if you're running War Machine. Basically, you swap ultimates, and you swap where Repentance and Blazing Spear are. So we'll swap those back real quick. Now there is one ultimate that you can use instead of Crescent Sweep if you don't want to use Crescent Sweep here. And that is going to be the Bow ultimate, Ballista. So there is an option here. You can basically use Ballista back here instead of Crescent Sweep. It's kind of up to you. I found that Ballista actually pulls a little bit lower than Crescent Sweep on average, but Crescent Sweep can be a little bit buggy sometimes, and that the hitbox is not exactly consistent. So if you want more consistent DPS, then you can run with Ballista, but Crescent Sweep is stronger when it works properly. So Crescent Sweep is also will help proc War Machine if you're running that. And it's kind of the same deal here. If you're running Ballista on the back bar, you will need to swap Repentance and Blazing Spear, so that way you still have Ancient Spear ability active while you're on your back bar here. Alright. Now going over our CPs. So the champion point CP cap is 780, which gives us 260 to put across each of the 3 different constellation types. So starting off with our green CPs. 75 into Mooncat and 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 110 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes really however you'd like. If you need some for PvP, because you PvP on this character as well, you can always go with that. It's kind of up to you where you want to put those points. I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 30 Warlord. If you want, you can even push Tenacity and Mooncat up to 100 if you'd like for that last percentage point, and then put the 60 wherever you'd like afterwards. Now for our blue CP, I want to kind of mention here that this is a raid. This is optimized for a organized raid group. So we will have Alkosh active. We're assuming we have Infused Pressure active, and obviously we're the ones providing minor fractures, so we don't have to necessarily worry about that. If your raid group does not have good Alkosh uptime or doesn't have good Crusher uptime, you might need to shift some points around into Piercing in order to kind of make up for that. You also want to take into consideration if you are not using Alkosh at all. That is a pretty big drop especially for stamina DPS. So you will need to make up for that loss in Alkosh by dumping a lot of points into Piercing here. So my recommendation here would actually to start taking out of Mighty first, drop that down to 56, drop Dumbthirst down to 56, Precise Strike down to 56, and then put those points into Piercing. If you do that, you should have, I believe, 18 more points to put into Piercing. That'll push you up to 41. And if you absolutely need to put more points into Piercing, then you can drop Mastered Arms down to probably 44. Is probably the lowest that I would drop it down to. As a Templar, Mastered Arms is not going to be quite as strong or not going to be quite as useful as Thaumaturge, just because I believe Jab scales off of Thaumaturge, not Mastered Arms. So that's something that you do want to take into consideration there. Now for our red CPs, this particular setup that I have is a balanced approach. So it is not going to be the best mitigation for any specific trial, but it is very good mitigation for all the trials. So if you do need to if you do want to maximize your mitigation in a specific trial, you will need to shift some points around accordingly. So I have 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and that leaves 10 points, which we'll put in Quick Recovery for the Field Physician passive. Now, as a Templar, you do get faster res speed, I should say. So you get 20% faster reses, which basically reduces your res time from 7 seconds down to 5 seconds. So Templars are pretty useful when it comes to resing in progression style groups. So it is nice to have a Field Physician passive while you're resurrecting, so that way you don't take as much damage, because remember, the stamina DPS, you don't have access to any shields. So that is why we have that 10 points of recovery here. So speaking of shields here, you will notice that I actually do not have Deadly Cloak on this bar. You can use Deadly Cloak if you would like. If you are going to be using Deadly Cloak on the front bar, because it has to be on the front bar, you basically put it in place of either Blazing Spear or Rearming Trap. I personally would take it, replace Blazing Spear, and then replace Rearming Trap with Blazing Spear. So your bars would look like this if you did want to use Deadly Cloak for the additional mitigation. Now, Repentance here is also sort of a flex spot. It's not going to be quite as useful for you during boss fights, but it's going to be very useful for you during ad pulls. Or boss fights with ads, because it does return stamina to you for every corpse that you basically repent. Now, there is one danger of using Repentance, and that is if there are multiple Templars in group, corpses can only be repentance to once. So once somebody uses repentance on a corpse, other Templars are not able to use repentance on that same corpse. So that's kind of the danger of running repentance. So if you don't want to run repentance, then you can replace this with something like Vigor instead. It's kind of up to you. I find it to be very useful for ad pulls, and I just keep it on my bar anyway, because you still get that 10% additional regen while on your back bar, which does end up helping out. Alright, so we're just going to real quick here put our bars back, we'll talk about our rotation. So our rotation is going to be static. There's not really too much going on here, and we do have one heavy attack on our front bar, so that'll help us sustain our otherwise light attack rotation. Like I mentioned, we do have Rearming Trap double barred here, but we will be using it on our front bar, not our back bar. So our rotation pretty much starts like any other stamina rotation. So you have Endless Hail, Caltrops, and Poison Injection on the back bar, 3 dots that you want to maintain. And when you use your ultimate, you want to use it first and then use Poison Injection, so that way you can bar swap cancel Poison Injection, which will inherit the weapon damage on your front bar if you did it fast enough. So it'll look something like this. Use your ultimate, and then use bar swap cancel out of your Poison Injection, because if it ticks on the front bar, the first tick happens on the front bar, then it'll inherit the weapon damage and max stam modifiers on your front bar instead. Now your front bar rotation is going to be pretty static. Power of the Light, Rending Slashes, you do a heavy attack, you jabs, trap, Power of the Light. Power of the Light, Rending Slashes, heavy attack, 2 jabs. So that's one thing if you don't want to run Blazing Spear, but you will actually want to do Blazing Spear, and that's because of the Burning Light passive. So whenever you deal damage with Atrix Spear ability, you have 25% chance to deal X amount of physical damage. This can occur every half a second. So Blazing Spear is what's going to help us proc Burning Light. The spear itself doesn't actually do that much damage. You can see here it does pretty paltry damage, but it does help give us that Burning Spear passive, because otherwise it's only proc off biting jabs and Crescent Sweep, so that's not nearly enough to really make Burning Light useful. So we will be using Blazing Spear actually. So Templars are kind of unique in that they're the only class that can use a magic ability to great effect. It's not because the magic ability does damage, but it's because it activates a passive. So if you're using Blazing Spear, you'll actually so your rotation is going to be Endless Hail, Caltrops, Ultimate, Poison Injection, Power of the Light, Rending Spears, Blazing Spear, Heavy Attack, Jabs, Power of the Light, Rearming Trap. And that's basically your entire rotation. It's pretty static. So yeah, that's pretty much your rotation. It's pretty static. There's not much that you're going to be doing to kind of change it up a little bit. The one thing that you might want to change up, and this is going to vary depending on each person, is instead of doing Power of the Light into Rending Slashes into Blazing Spear, some people will do Power of the Light into Blazing Spear into Rending Slashes. So the order of the first, second, and third ability on your front bar might change depending on personal preference. I generally do Rending Slashes into Blazing Spear, so that's how I do it. Alright, so we'll do a 6 minute dummy part so you guys can get an idea of the DPS we're able to pull on a Templar. The one thing I do want to mention here is that Templars do not have native source of major fracture, so we only have minor fracture. So this will naturally make our DPS seem lower than classes that do have major fracture built into their skills. So DKs, for instance, Nightblades, they'll generally show higher parses on dummies just because they have major fracture. So I did do a little bit of math beforehand, and with major fracture, as well as the minor fracture as well, we'll actually get about 9% additional DPS. If we take away the minor fracture, it'll end up being closer to 8 or 7%. So we'll do the math at the end to kind of see what we're actually able to pull, so you have a comparison point with that major fracture when we consider that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the 6 million dummy parts. It's going to be fairly boring just because the rotation, again, is static. So the big thing here with this rotation is that if you don't have any lag, it actually has very good power of light uptime. You have very little downtime with power of the light, and that's probably the most important thing to do as a Templar. Is basically minimize the downtime on power of the light, not just for the debuff, but also because it does a decent amount of damage. So you will have some downtime. There's going to be about a second of downtime when you have to use Crescent Sweep. See here, when we don't have Crescent, we use Crescent Sweep on the back bar. There's basically no downtime, but when we use Crescent Sweep, there was some downtime there. But overall, this rotation does have very good sustain here, and has very good power of the light uptime. So there we go, that is our parse there. So over here we have pulled 40.9k right on the money, so that's really nice to have there. So pretty good DPS, and again, it is, if you want to take into consideration major fracture, it's going to be just under 9% additional DPS. So we would be looking probably closer to around 45k, 44k or so DPS. If we also want to consider in minor fracture. If we don't want to consider minor fracture, we just want just major fracture, because not all classes again also have major fracture. Minor fracture, I should say, then it's going to be a little bit less. It's going to be closer to 8 to 7% additional DPS, in which case we're actually looking closer to about 44k, just maybe high 43k or something like that. So Stamplars do end up pulling a little bit less than Stamsorks, definitely lower than Stamina Nightblades. Stamplars are kind of on the lower end of the Stamina DPS scale, so that's just kind of the nature of the game. They have a very important debuff, that's Power of the Light, but again, they suffer from fairly poor sustain, relatively poor sustain compared to the other classes, I should say, stamina classes, and their DPS is going to be a little bit lower. Now, some people might be interested to know why I'm using the Ravager instead of the Advanced Yokeda, because you would think higher crit chance, because I get 10% crit damage, Advanced Yokeda would be better, but that's actually not necessarily going to be the case here. So the Ravager, here I only have 61% uptime, but I do have a couple other fights here that I saved with the Ravager that had a lot higher uptime. So they have 73% uptime on this is not an actual price. It's 63% uptime here. We had 71% uptime here. We got 70% uptime here. So Ravager uptime is actually really good on a Stamplar. Berserking Warrior here, this is a Berserking Warrior parse here, so pretty similar, but you can see here that Ravager parses are a little bit higher. So this is an example of a Ravager parse that I did, which was a little bit better than what I pulled here, so 41.5k. And so the reason why Ravager is so high here is because jabs can proc Ravager, Arms Relequen can proc Ravager, light attacks can proc Ravager, and I believe there's another ability that procs Ravager. Crescent Sweep can also proc Ravager as well. The initial take of Rending Slashes can proc Ravager. So those are all a lot of different ways you can proc Ravager, so it's actually better on a Stamplar than, let's say, on a Stamina Warden. Just because Stamina Warriors don't really have as many ways to proc Ravager. But by all means, you saw that Advancing Yokeda parse, which was also around 40.9k. The difference between them is pretty small overall. You can realistically go with either set here, Ravager or Advancing Yokeda. But the Ravager, for my testing, has higher max parses, so it's a little bit higher on average compared to Advancing Yokeda, surprisingly enough. So you can see here that Burning Light does a decent amount of DPS. It actually does more than Fighting Jabs does. And that's mainly because we're maintaining Blazing Spear. So you can see Blazing Spear, like I mentioned, doesn't do a whole ton of DPS, 1% of our DPS. So it's really important that we keep Blazing Spear up, though, for that Burning Light passive here. Alright, and then if you want to take a look at Power of Light uptime, we see we get 93% uptime here, which is pretty decent. Again, this particular rotation minimizes the downtime of Power of Light while still maintaining good resources by having that one heavy attack and a front part rotation. So I think, obviously it's not going to be perfect, but I think this is a good trade-off between maintaining Power of Light uptime while not sacrificing too much when it comes to sustain overall. So that is it for this video. If you guys have any questions about this build or Stamplars in general, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below and I'll answer them to the best of my abilities. I don't normally play Stamplar. My preferred stamina class when I do play is usually going to be either Sorc or Nightblade. So I'm not quite as knowledgeable on Stamplar as I am with other stamina classes. But I do know a couple of people who main Stamplar, so I can always ask them and see if they have better answers than what I can provide and share them with you guys. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.